it kind of leads to some of the next questions, like who's going to be the quarterback here? And Brady, you've been kind of like the voice in the darkness shouting about this for the last couple of weeks. Like, hey guys, right after the Super Bowl, there's a gigantic decision to be made.
There is, yeah. So 5 days after the Super Bowl, which is February 11th, so 5 days later, February 16th, that is when Geno Smith's $12.7 million base salary for next season would become fully guaranteed if he's still on the roster. So this is the way the Seahawks and other teams structure a lot of their contracts where, because the Seahawks don't fully guarantee money beyond year one, they use this kind of what's called, vesting guarantee where it vests into a full guarantee provided you're still on the roster by a certain date.
Mm-hmm.
And so $12.7 million becomes fully guaranteed on February 16th, which effectively serves as a deadline for them to cut him. Like if they're going to cut him, it's almost certainly going to happen before that date because they're not going to wait until after that date where the salary becomes fully guaranteed and then cut him. That's pointless because we still owe him that money. The reason you cut him is to avoid having to pay him that money. So if they're going to cut him, that is the deadline. Now, cutting him is not necessarily the only way that they could move on from him. If they could find a trade partner, that is another option. And to me, that seems like the more likely option of the two, meaning if they're going to move on from him, I think it'd be more likely a trade scenario because, and we've talked about this before, if you have to make that decision before February 16th, look, the way that this coaching search is going, you may not even have a head coach in place until February 12th, February 13th. So, and obviously, look, this is going to be John's decision, but he's going to heavily involve the head coach.
Yeah. So what, just because you brought up an idea that I hadn't really considered, if they were to trade Geno Smith, what's he worth?
Yeah, if a team is picking up that contract, right, the $22.5 million that he's scheduled to make next season, I don't think a whole lot. I think you're probably looking at a day 3 pick, if at all. Now maybe if the Seahawks were intent on moving on from him this offseason, maybe there is something that they could do, finagling the contract. We saw the Seahawks and Giants do that. Remember the Giants
paid down the contract.
Right. They basically dropped down the salary to a minimum salary deal in order to make that contract more tradable to the Seahawks. So there's a number of different things that you could do. But if they were to trade him, the deadline for that would be, basically the start of free agency or really before 5 days into free agency, because that's when he'd be due a $9.6 million roster bonus. So that window right there, before February 16th, if they're going to cut him, and then before, say, March 18th, if they're going to trade him.
Wow. Yeah. What do you think they do?
I think that there's a lot working against both a trade and a release. The timing, again, of the release being that, if you released him before February 16th, they will not have seen any quarterbacks at the combine. They will not have met with any quarterbacks at the combine. So you don't have a great feel for what's behind door number 2 and 3.
Well, you've seen film on them. I mean,
yeah, but you haven't met with those guys. You haven't gotten the measurements on them, the medicals on them that you would get at the combine. So there would be a lot of unknown there. And again, trading for him, I just don't think you're going to get a whole lot in return. I think if they were to trade him, it would be more about getting rid of the contract than it would be about getting anything substantial in return. But I think the key point in all of this, Mike, is that, look, Pete Carroll was a Geno Smith guy. We heard that time and time again, and we saw that. Mm-hmm. Pete's no longer here, and there's a new person calling the shots. And I don't think that John Schneider is a Geno guy to the same degree that Pete Carroll was. And so the fact that Pete's no longer here, I think Geno's job security is not as strong.
It leads to maybe a bigger, broader question that I don't know that I've heard asked, and maybe we should bring it up for the first time. With a new coach coming in, how significantly do you think the roster will change? If you're a new coach coming in to take on this job, are you looking to build with the current roster, or are you looking to start a rebuild in your own vision? And I don't know the answer, and maybe it depends on which of these coaches they go to. But we've spent a while talking about questions you would ask a new coach or questions that a coach would ask John Schneider. I think that would be one they would each have for each other. Hey, if you hire me here, are you expecting me to use this roster and build around what you've got? Or do I have a few years to make it look like what I want? Because if it's the latter, I'm probably jettisoning Geno Smith and saying, yeah, I'm out. That's not what I want. Save the money. Let's go young. I want to build something in my image. Let's move it along. But if you're telling me that, yeah, I'm looking to basically build around this roster, yeah, I want Geno Smith. And if I still find a quarterback, fine, he'll be the bridge. And if I don't, well, then we'll go, offensive or defensive line with those first few picks, and Geno will just be it for another year or two.
Yeah,
it's a huge question.
Right, and that's a great point, and you know that John Schneider is asking that question to every single candidate.
I would hope so.
That he's interviewing. Yeah, and it's a really good point because there are certain coaches that are very, specific in the type of person, like Ejiro Evero, the defensive coordinator for Carolina, who was with Denver the year before, who had been with the Rams before that. From what I understand about him, he is very rigid in the type of defensive players he wants at certain spots. So, he that could come into play with him. Now, he also comes from the, Brandon Staley, Vic Fangio tree, which Seahawks have sort of been running that defense here. So that may not be a huge departure defensively, but the larger point is certain coaches, if depending on what side of the ball they come from, they might have very rigid standards for the types of players they want playing defense or offense, and that could come into play here. And look, I don't think that John Schneider necessarily wants to tear down the roster that he's been building for the last few years. There's going to be some of those players that move on just naturally because of production and contract, but yeah, I wouldn't think that he would want to completely start over roster-wise.
Yeah, I think it would be a fascinating, if I could be a fly on the wall for any of these conversations between John and the coaches. Yes, I would love to hear about their leadership skills because I think those are enormously important. Yes, I would like to hear about their visions. But I would sure love to know, who on this roster they believe is worthy of being here long term and who they would just kind of move on from and look to bring in their own kind of guys. And yeah, I think that would very much dictate to me what I would want to do with Geno Smith. I think he's going to be here. To answer the question I asked you, I just don't think he is going to end up going somewhere else. It just seems like he's not that expensive. You can always move on from him next year as well. And unless you knew for sure who your quarterback was going to be, unless there's somebody out there who likes Drew Lock and wants to, commit to Drew less money for a longer term, maybe. But at that point, why wouldn't you just stick with Geno? It's not that much money and there's not that much of a commitment.
You know who really likes Drew Lock? John Schneider.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's just, I agree with you. I think the most likely outcome is that Geno Smith is back for at least one more year. They see if a new coach / new offensive system can really, get him back to that, early 2022, even late 2023 form. I just don't think it's a sure thing because the guy who was his biggest advocate in the building is no longer there.
Yeah, well, Steven Ruiz, I mentioned, was on the station yesterday with Bump and Stacy, and he's definitely a Geno fan.
I thought he showed that the year before wasn't a fluke. Now the question is about his ceiling, how far can he take this franchise? And I think those questions are legitimate. I would like to see him get to play behind a more consistent offensive line. That's something we haven't really gotten to see the last 2 years in the second half. When he was kept clean, he was one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. When he was under pressure, he was one of the worst. It's kind of figuring out the right balance and getting an offensive line that can put him in those situations where he has been one of the better quarterbacks.
Well, and clearly they had their issues up front on both sides of the ball last year. And yet I posted that yesterday, and Ray Roberts, great point from Ray, comes in and is like, is that because of personnel or is it because it wasn't a great scheme communicated very well to that personnel? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, they started 9 different starting combinations on their offensive line.
But by the end of the year, when they got worse, they were down to basically their starters.
Right.
That kind of ended when they were better starting 9 different combos.
Yeah, some in the middle of the season when they didn't have Lucas there and when they were switching guys. I mean, they weathered that sort of like the Detroit game. I still can't believe how well that offensive line performed in that game, in that building, with those 2 tackles that they had. But a few weeks after that, it really started to show. I think with Geno, he is kind of the representation to me of this silly sort of way that some people tend to look at quarterbacks, players generally, but specifically quarterbacks, where we are in this age of social media, surface level reaction where you're either trash or you're the GOAT, and people leave no room for the in-between, when in reality there's a massive swath of that in between, and Geno is in between there. And sometimes he plays great, like a top 10 quarterback. Sometimes he doesn't. And so I think the difference there is that, a key variable there is what's going on around him. And there was a lot of stuff that went wrong around him this past season.
Well, go